civil unrest has sparked challenging questions that need to be answered. Joining us over video chat to explain the history of American racism and what can be done to pave a way for change is Associate Professor in the Department of African American Studies and History at the U of I, Erik McDuffie. Good morning, Professor. How you doing?
Good morning. I'm doing fine, and how are you?
Good, thank you, and thank you so much for your time this morning. We appreciate you sparking this conversation with us this morning.
Sure, of course, and I hope you and your family are well during this very difficult time.
It sure is, and you the same. So let's start with the history of racism in our country and why there's so much pain.
Sure. Well, I think it would be useful to define what we mean by racism. So I'm going to just quote the scholar Ruthie Wilson Gilmore, who defines racism, quote, specifically as the state-sanctioned or extra-legal production and exploitation of group differentiated vulnerability to premature death, end quote. And what exactly does that mean? Basically, it means that public policies, economic structures, the powers that be create a system that exploits, marginalizes, and in many cases leads to the premature death of people of color. And I think we can very much see that with the COVID crisis, the way in which Black, Brown, and indigenous populations have been hit very hard. And of course, the state violence that we have seen, the police killings of people such as George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Tony McDade, Sean Monterosa out in the Bay Area. I think it's important for us to keep in mind that this country, indeed the modern world, slavery, racism, colonialism, have been stealing and looting of the people, the resources, lands of people of color, have been foundational to the making of this country and the modern world. This country, again, was founded on the dispossession of indigenous lands, the enslavement of African peoples. The U.S. Constitution was a pro-slavery document. The 1807 Insurrection Act that the president is using to authorize the deployment of U.S. forces, the Army across states and cities in this country, was a slave-era law. The Chinese Exclusion Acts, the Bracero programs, and of course, as far as ICE and what we're seeing against undocumented people, this is all linked to a very, very long and painful and exploitative history. And so what we're seeing today is not in some ways an aberration from the past, but is very much a living legacy of historical forms of exploitation and oppression.
So what do you feel that we really need to understand about the social unrest following specifically George Floyd, but, you know, the list goes on?
Sure. Well, in short, I mean, certainly people are rightfully incensed, infuriated by what they saw in that video, and they took to the streets not only in this country, but indeed across the world. But these protests increasingly are not only about the death of George Floyd and the long list of other people, but a long list of grievances. Again, the way in which COVID has disproportionately affected and killed people of color, as well as really, and again, what we're hearing, people, or rather a frustration about being left behind economically. We've seen for years declining wages, people struggling. So a whole list of demands for creating a better world are coming through in these protests.
And you mentioned the pandemic disproportionately affecting the Black community. Can you go into that in a little bit more in depth?
Sure. Well, here, in Illinois and Chicago, Black folks make up approximately 30% of the population, yet 60% of the deaths. Black people often don't have insurance. They go to the doctor at the last minute because, again, they don't have insurance. We suffer from hypertension, obesity. I mean, basically, as one Black doctor said, being Black in this country, being of color in this country makes you sick. And again, that this country does not have a national health care system to make sure that there's preventative care helps explain why we're seeing such high death rates for Black folks and other folks of color.
So, Professor, we're really talking about this on a wide scale because, of course, this issue is very wide scale. But can we talk a little bit more close to home and how you think the Champaign-Urbana community has handled the situation and what you think it's like back here at home in Central Illinois?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, what we're seeing here in Champaign-Urbana is a microcosm from what's happening across the country and world. I mean, just up in Rantoul, there was, of course, that massive spike in infections at a meat processing plant. Many of those folks are migrants. Latinx, right here in town. Of course, there was the Kewan Carrington case about 10 years ago, the Champaign cops shooting and killing a young Black man. So what we're seeing here, again, in Champaign County and Champaign-Urbana is really no different from what we're seeing across the country and world. It's exciting seeing all the folks on the street making their voices known, demanding a better world, and I hope folks will stay out there in the streets and demand defunding the police, demand more funding for schools, demand creating a better world.
So, Professor, do you think that those are the main ways that we can improve, or do you have any other suggestions for improvement here?
Well, I mean, certainly, of course, we have the 2020 election coming up, and I think it's imperative, and I'm speaking now as a private citizen here, but I think it's imperative that we remove the current occupant of the White House who's played a major role in helping this crisis just explode, and again, how it's affected folks of color and beyond. But again, I think it's key for folks to educate themselves, learn about the history, the past, understand how the past is very much part of the present, and to again demand envision what is possible, or indeed impossible. Let's try to create a world where Black and brown folks are not killed by the police, or Black and brown folks where everyone can truly thrive as a human being. I mean, what a fantastic world that would be.
That's for sure. So, of course, a lot of people, there's a lot of fear surrounding this conversation. A lot of people are uncomfortable having it. But why do you think it is so important for us to come together and have these tough conversations and really learn from one another?
Well, it's a great question. Thank you for it. I mean, what I would say is, one, we're all in this together. We are one human species on one planet, and if we cannot get this country and the world going in the right direction, things will not work out. I think it's important to keep in mind that perhaps the person who might have been able to have a cure for cancer or HIV, or might make some huge discovery, that person might have passed away, will never be able to realize their potential in this current environment. And again, just thinking about all the folks who are scared or beat down or killed by the police, or go to underfunded schools or in prison, and again, that talent and possibility that unfortunately cannot and perhaps will not be realized. So again, I think it behooves us all. If we truly want to live in a democratic country, a country that works for everyone, then we need to address these systemic issues around policing, economic inequalities, and what have you, indeed.
Professor McDuffie, thank you. It's very good to get your perspective this morning. We appreciate your time, and let's continue to have this conversation.
It's my pleasure, and I hope you will have me back sometime.
Definitely. Thanks for your time.
All right. Thank you.
Have a great day.
You take care. You too.